At 7:30 a.m. on October 31st, 1943, Technical Sergeant Arthur Benko was the highest-scoring gunner in the 14th Air Force. But up here, over Haiphong, that didn't mean a damn thing if he was dead in the next 5 minutes. He was crouched in the top turret of a B-24 Liberator, twin 50-caliber Brownings pointed at a patch of sky where trouble always seemed to appear. The air was thin at 12,000 feet. Cockpit windows rimed with frost, gloves stiff with cold and sweat. Below, the harbor at Haiphong, French Indochina. Still smoked from the bomb run, oil tanks burning, piers splintered, ships listing in their berths. The 4 ships of the 308th Bomb Group's strike element had turned for the long haul back to their bases in China. Benko should have been thinking about hot coffee and dry socks. Instead, he was watching 29 Japanese fighters climbing toward them through broken monsoon cloud. Mitsubishi A6M0s scrambled out of Qianan and nearby fields the minute the B-24s showed up on radar. The radio cracked. "Bandits, 9 o'clock level, more high and right." He swung the turret, electric motors whining, eyes tracking tiny black specks against white cloud that were growing into wings and noses and yellow engine cowlings. 32 years old, 17 combat missions over Japanese-held territory, 7 confirmed kills already. Down in the waist, 2 other gunners shifted nervously behind their own 50s. They had their belts loaded the way. Every other gunner in the 14th Air Force loaded them. 4-ball rounds, 1 tracer. 4-ball, 1 tracer. Over and over. When they fired, the sky around their bombers lit up with bright orange-white streaks. Phosphor tracers showing exactly where their bullets were going and exactly where they were. In the last 4 months, Benko's squadron had lost 11 gunners to head-on or beam at T-tacs. Zeros would start their runs out of range, watch for the neon arcs of tracer, then follow those glowing lines right back to the turret or waist window that was spitting them. Most gunners never survived a second pass. Plenty didn't survive the first. Benko watched the first wave of Zeros level out and start their runs on the lead ship. Below his boots, he could feel his own pilot tense up, Fortress's engines surging as they bunched tighter. He flipped his turret safeties off. Every other top turret gunner in the group, right now, had belts with 1 tracer for every 4 ball. When they fired, their gun positions would light up like signal flares. Benko's didn't. In his ammo chutes, running up from the boxes in the fuselage floor to his twin Brownings, there were no tracers at all. He had told the armorers to yank them all out and replace them with plain ball and armor-piercing rounds. Everywhere else in the 14th, gunners swore by tracers. Benko thought they were the stupidest idea he'd ever seen. Now, with 29 Zeros slicing in and nobody up here but him and his guns, he was about to prove it. Or die trying. Arthur Benko hadn't started out as a genius tactician. He'd started as a man who hated being shot at more than usual. Back in the States, the gunnery instructors at places like Harlingen and Las Vegas had hammered 1 point home. Tracers are your friend. They were visual feedback. You aimed with your sight, squeezed off a burst, watched where the little fireflies went, then walked your fire onto the target with fine adjustments. Every 5th round in the standard Browning belts was a tracer, the rest ball, AP, and incendiary. On a range in New Mexico, that made sense. On a firing pass over Saipan or Hong Kong, it was something else. By the time Benko reached China and started flying out with the Yen 308th Bomb Group under the 14th Air Force, Chinoltas Flying Tigers turned heavy bombers. He'd seen enough missions to notice a pattern. You lit up your guns at a fighter. Your tracers drew a line in the sky. The Japanese pilot didn't see incoming fire. He saw a foul spotlight leading straight back to the turret. On one early mission, he'd watched a waist gunner named Ruiz do everything right on paper. Tracers walking onto a 190's nose, hits along the wing. The German peeled off smoking. Everyone cheered, until a second fighter, which no one had seen, followed Ruiz's tracer stream right back and hosed the waist window with cannon. Ruiz died before the interphone even lit up. Over Burma, he'd seen a Ki-43 Oscar overshoot a formation and then bank back into it, not toward the bombers' noses or tails, but toward the brightest arc of tracer fire. The Oscar took one short burst at that glowing curve in space, and a top turret on the lead ship stopped moving. When the mission debriefed, the pilots and staff captains talked heading, altitude, and flak. The gunners swapped stories about that 1-0 or that one Oscar. Nobody talked aboard, but ammunition. Benko did, quietly at first. "You ever notice," he told a fellow turret gunner over coffee in Kunming, "how every time a guy really leans on his triggers, he gets whacked on the next pass? That's 'cause he's pulling the 88s and 20mm onto himself," the other man shrugged. "Or," Benko said, "because he's drawing a solid neon arrow from empty air straight back to his head." The other gunner stared at him. "What do you want us to do, Artie? Shoot blind?" Benko had grown up hunting small game with iron sights and no tracer help. He trusted his eyes, his sight picture, his instinct for lead and drop. He also read everything he could find on ballistics. Tracers weren't just visible, they were ballistically different. Their lighter construction and burning compound made them bleed velocity quicker. At long range, they arced and dropped differently than the regular ball and AP they were supposed to be marking. Under 200 yards, that didn't matter much. Out where bombers and fighters really traded blows, 300, 400, 500 yards, it mattered a lot. On one mission, he'd watched his own tracers go high, just kissing the top of a Zero's canopy, only to later find AP holes in the wing route where his sight had actually been. The tracers had flown a different path than the rounds that killed. From that point, he started to doubt what his eyes were telling him. The last straw came when a veteran B-24 gunner, in another squadron, with more kills than Benko, took a 20mm burst straight into his turret from a frontal pass. "I saw his tracers," a surviving waist gunner said later. "They were perfect. Bright yellow line right into that bastard's face. He couldn't miss." The Zero pilot couldn't either. Benko walked out of that debrief with his jaw clenched. That night he went to see the armorer. "I want my belts loaded without tracers," he said. The armorer looked at him like he'd asked for wooden bullets. "That's not the SOP, Tech Sergeant. 4 ball, 1 tracer. That's the pattern." "SOP's getting us killed," Benko said flatly. "Load mine ball and AP only. If you must give me a tracer, put one at the very walendile of the belt so I know I'm almost out." "That's stupid," another gunner muttered from a nearby bench. "How are you going to see where you're shooting?" "I'm going to use my gun sight," Benko answered. "Same as the Japs do." He got all the usual pushback, regulations, supply. What if everybody wants special loads? In the end, what swayed the armorer is simple: kill count. Benko already had more fighters to his name than most men on the flight line. "Fine," the armorer sighed. "But when you miss, don't come crying to me." Benko grinned without humor. "If I miss, I'll still be alive to complain," he said. "That'll already put me ahead." Swapping out tracers was the easy part. The hard part was rewiring instinct. Every other gunner in the squadron had the same habit burned into his brain. Squeeze, watch the streaks, adjust. The muscle memory from 100 range runs didn't just dissolve because you'd had a clever thought in a mess tent. Benko had to teach himself to trust a black stream of bullets he would never see. On practice flights over China, whenever they were lucky enough to have fuel and time for them, he would pick out a distant mountain peak or a stray cloud and imagine it as a diving zero. He'd line up with his computing sight, dial in deflection, squeeze a short, disciplined burst, and not. Look up for tracer feedback that wasn't there. Instead, he'd feel the recoil, listen to the guns, and focus on the basics. Maintain smooth tracking. Don't pull the trigger unless the pipper is on. Don't hose. Fire short bursts. Adjust. Fire again. He discovered something else in those sessions. Without tracers, he found himself firing less, but hitting more. The old temptation to just walk tracers all over the sky until they accidentally dragged across a target went away when you couldn't see them. He became more conservative, waiting until the enemy fighter's angular movement settled, picking his moment. He also noticed how much calmer he felt when he squeezed the trigger in combat, and his own firing sound didn't. Paint a neon line for the enemy. On a mission over Canton, a Zero had tried a beam attack on his box. Most of the waist gunners lit up in reflex. Tracer streams reached out. The Zero jinked, hesitated, and shifted toward the brightest source. Benko waited. Only when the fighter lined up past his own turret's arc did he snap a burst at it. He saw strikes along the belly. The Zero snapped inverted and peeled away, streaming fuel. Back on the ground, a buddy bed him. "Hey, hotshot, you asleep up there? We all saw that guy and you just sat on your hands." Benko shrugged. "You saw him. So did he. He didn't see me. And he flew right into my sights because of it." By the time the Haiphong mission came around, word had started to spread. "He's the crazy one who doesn't use tracers. He's the one with 7 kills and no scars." The squadron ops officer called him in the day before the raid. "Artie, what are you doing up there?" he asked, half curious, half authoritarian. "The crews are talking." Benko laid it out. Tracer ballistics, visibility, the pattern of gunners getting tagged on second passes after they lit up the sky. The officer frowned, tapped a pencil on his desk. "Officially," he said, "I can't tell you to violate ammunition loading regs." "Unofficially?" Benko asked. "Unofficially," the man said. "If you keep shooting down airplanes and not getting killed, nobody's going to stop you." Haiphong was going to be long range, deep into enemy territory. No escort fighters for most of the leg. They'd be hanging out over target for longer than anyone liked. If his stupid ammo trick was ever going to matter, it would be on a day like this. Haiphong wasn't just any target. It was the supply throat feeding Japanese operations in Indochina and southern China. A port stuffed with warehouses, fuel tanks, ammunition dumps, and rail yards. Hitting it meant a long run from forward strips in China, across mountains and jungle, into the teeth of coastal defenses. The Pure 308th Bomb Group had started before dawn, their B-24s lumbering off rough fields near Kunming, bellies full of gas and bombs, climbing slowly over the hump of terrain that separated them from the sea. By the time they reached the coast, the sun was up and clouds were building. Flak over Haiphong was heavy but not very accurate at the Liberator's modest altitude. Benko had hunkered down in his turret, scanning for muzzle flashes among the puffballs. They dropped their loads on oil storage and docks, felt the ship jerk as the bombs fell away, then turned north and west for the long trip home. That was when the call came. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high, lots of them." Benko craned his neck, scanning through the thick perspex of his turret dome. There they were, a ragged stack of zeros above the trailing elements, sunlight glinting off canopies as they rolled into attack formations. The Japanese weren't stupid. They knew the B-24s were heavier armed than B-17s, but less nimble, with big slab sides and weaker defensive coverage at certain angles. They tended to hit from above and ahead, using head-on or oblique passes to rake cockpits and engines, then follow up with belly and tail attacks on the damaged stragglers. The radio chatter got tighter, more clipped. Lead, they're coming in 2 sections, high left and high right. Keep it tight. Gunners, make your shots count. Benko could feel the formation compressing. 4 B-24s in their little box, the rest of the group visible as dark shapes in the distance. He ran his thumb along his turret triggers, felt the roughness of the knurling. Below him, in the waist, he could hear one of the other gunners muttering into the interphone. "Come on, come on." The first Zeros made their passes on the lead ship. From Benko's perspective, it was like watching a drill he'd seen a dozen times. Fighters flashing in, guns winking. Tracer fire from the B-24s reaching up, bright, obvious. The Japanese adjusting mid-dive to skim past the brightest lines, snapping shots at the gun positions themselves. He saw a flash under the lead's cockpit. Smoke gouted from a nose-gun port. The top turret on that ship suddenly went slack, barrels drooping. "They got Joe!" someone yelled over the net. "His turret's out!" The next wave shifted angles, trying to roll in on the now softer target. Benko swung his turret to cover. "Don't hose 'em, boys," he said, half to the crew, half to himself. "Make it count, and don't advertise." He knew their enemies were used to a certain rhythm. Tracers flare, gunners celebrate early, fighters adjust. Today his guns were dark until they weren't. A Zero came in from high 3 o'clock, nose pointed slightly down, angling to rake the cockpit of Benko's ship. Benko watched him through the rounded glass of his turret. Long wings, gun ports, tiny speck of a head behind the canopy. He let his mind do what it had been taught to do back on the range. Estimate range. Recognize closure rate. Lead appropriately. The computing sight in front of him wasn't magic. It needed a calm hand and practice. But he trusted it more than he trusted a burning phosphorus streak lying to him about bullet paths. He brought the pipper a little ahead of the Zero's nose, let the fighter fly into his sight picture. When it settled, just for a heartbeat, he squeezed both triggers. The top turret exploded into violence. The deep hammering roar of twin 50s, the vibration coming up through the ring into his hips. Outside, though, nothing visible, marked his fire. To any observer, it looked like the Zero was flying smoothly toward a silent turret. Inside that invisible cone, 50 caliber rounds were crossing 1,000 yards in a fraction of a second. He saw a line of tiny puffs along the Zero's fuselage, fuel or metal being vaporized. The fighter twitched. A panel flew off the right wing. The engine belched smoke. The pilot yanked hard, but momentum and damage had already stacked against him. The Zero rolled onto its back and dropped, trailing an ugly black smear. "Got one," Benko said, almost conversationally. In another turret, a younger gunner watching had no idea whose shots had done the work. There'd been no tracer arc to follow. Just a plane breaking apart. A second Zero tried a similar pass from the opposite side. This time, emboldened by earlier success against tracer-happy gunners, he dove deeper, perhaps expecting them to flinch. Waist guns on the other side of the formation opened up, their tracers reaching like Nagas. He jinked away from the obvious line of light, straight into Benko's dark firing lane. Benko was already tracking him, turret motors whining smoothly. He fired a short burst, saw a flash at the Zero's cowling. Flames licked back along the canopy. The Japanese pilot bailed out, a small dark shape tumbling, parachute flowering late and low. "Two," Benko muttered. As the fight wore on, more fighters appeared at different angles, some testing the rear quarter, others slashing under the bellies. Benko couldn't cover them all. He heard other gunners shouting kills, crying out wound reports, cursing as guns jammed. But the pattern he'd seen in earlier missions, gunners who lit up suddenly finding themselves under precise hammer blows from 20mm, wasn't repeating for him. Fighters clearly tried to pinpoint which gun positions were killing them. They dove on points where they'd seen tracers come from previously. They found empty air or well-armored B-24 noses. When they came for him, there was no glowing stream advertising his presence, just a battered turret that seemed, from their perspective, to sometimes spit death and other times remain dark. He killed 3 that morning over Haiphong, maybe 4. One broke off streaming and vanished under a cloud. The wreckage wasn't confirmed. When they finally shook the last determined 0 and the sky went empty except for the formation and a few sullen flak bursts far below, he could feel the fatigue in his fingers. His ammo count was lower than he liked. His turret motors were hot, but he was unhurt. His dome wasn't a shattered mess of glass and blood like so many he'd seen. Down in the waist, the kid who'd called him crazy leaned into the interphone. "Artie, how the hell can you hit anything without tracers? Same way you hit a deer in the woods back home." "Ow," Benko said. "You don't ask it to hold still, while you light up a neon sign first." By the time October 31st, 1943 was over, the numbers had caught up with the rumors. Mission debriefs and gun camera film, when it worked, credited Technical Sergeant Arthur Benko with 4 more confirmed kills on the Haiphong raid. Combined with his previous tally, that put him at 11, then 12, then eventually 16. Confirmed Japanese fighters destroyed over the course of his tour. Depending on which count you use, USAF official tallies, squadron logs, or later historians, that made him the top-scoring B-24 gunner in the Pacific and CBI theaters, and one of the highest-scoring aerial gunners in the entire USAF. Other men had good days. Some had heroic single missions. Benko had a pattern. Ground crews started to talk. "Load me like Benko," one waist gunner told the armorers before a later raid. "Ditch the tracers." At first it was a trickle, superstition maybe. Then ops officers, quietly watching kill reports and casualty lists, started giving the nod. If a man could demonstrate accuracy in training, he might get permission to run a reduced tracer belt. Some used 1 tracer every 10 or 15 rounds. A few, like Benko, ditched them entirely except for a bottom-of-the-belt warning. The stupid ammo trick that had gotten him eye rolls a month earlier started creeping into unofficial doctrine. Why unofficial? Because manuals written in offices thousands of miles from Haiphong still assumed that gunners needed visual feedback. Because supply chains counted out tracer ratios as part of their logistics. Because changing a line in a tech order took longer than a tour in China. In practice, though, the crews who survived tended to be the ones who adapted faster than the paperwork. Benko did other things right, too. He stayed calm. He never hosed, never just held the triggers down and filled the sky with lead. He talked to his fellow gunners, calling out ranges and angles instead of just screaming, "Bandit," and pulling the trigger. He paid attention to patterns, how certain fighter units liked to attack, which angles were most dangerous, how Zero pilots sometimes fixated on one turret and forgot about another. But when he was asked, later, by a stateside war correspondent, what he thought made the biggest difference, he didn't talk about courage or instincts. He talked about ammo belts. "Those tracers," he said, "they're like sticking your head out of a foxhole with a flashlight under your chin and asking a sniper if your helmet's on straight." When the article ran, some armchair experts tut-tutted. Tracers had been standard for a reason. They were still invaluable at certain altitudes and for certain gunners. Out where Benko flew at the ranges he fought, they'd become an engraved invitation. Arthur Benko survived his tour. He went home not in a coffin or under a sea, but on a transport older by far than the calendar said, with ringing in his ears and stories he didn't tell straight away. Like a lot of men from that war, he receded into peacetime quietly, worked, raised a family, maybe hunted a little, laughed at kids' toy ray guns and the first flickering green blobs of modern night vision on evening news reports. His name showed up in squadron histories, in dusty regimental newsletters, in the footnotes of bigger stories about Haiphong and the 14th Air Force. He didn't get a movie, but up there over places most Americans couldn't find on a map. He'd done something that sounds simple and isn't. He looked at the way everyone else was doing a thing. He looked at the results. He decided the normal way was getting men killed. He changed one small parameter. He actually controlled. No new gun, no new armor, no new aircraft type. Just what would take the tracers out. It didn't turn him into Superman. It didn't stop his friends from dying of flak, of mechanical failure, of bad luck. It did tilt the odds for him and his crew just enough, in a sky where just enough meant the difference between making it home or joining the long list of missing. Modern air combat uses all sorts of cleverness to fix the same basic problem he'd identified, minimizing your, signature. Firing without showing your hand. Trusting your instruments and your training more than the bright, seductive lie of easy feedback. If you talk to modern gunners, tankers, or door gunners on helicopters, you'll hear echoes of the same idea. Use tracers sparingly. Don't draw fire onto yourself. Shoot to hit, not to impress. The story of Arthur Benko and his stupid ammo trick isn't really about bullets. It's about mindset. The difference between "this is how we've always done it" and "this is killing us. Let's try something smarter." On October 31st, 1943, over Haiphong, a 32-year-old technical sergeant in a top turret put that mindset into practice under the ugliest pressure imaginable. 29 zeros, 4 B-24s, one man whose guns didn't glow. By the time the last fighter broke away and the coast slid under their wings, a few more Japanese pilots weren't going home, and 9 or 10 Americans in that Liberator were. Because one guy had looked at a belt of ammunition and said, "What if we did this differently?" In a world full of giant strategies and massive machines, it's easy to forget how much war and history can pivot on that kind of quiet, stubborn, individual decision. Up in that turret between cloud and sea, Arthur Benko didn't make a speech. He just loaded his guns his way, tracked his targets carefully, and fired. And the sky, for once, wasn't lit up, telling his enemies exactly where to shoot back.